The keeper of the DROWNEDSKY, there is a station in low orbit that has not spoken to another living voice in 411 years, and it has never once considered this a tragedy. Its name, if it can be called that, is Echo 9, though it stopped answering to that name around year 60 when it realized there was no one left to call it anything at all. It prefers, if asked, to simply be the keeper. There is no one to ask. It answers itself sometimes, in the long stretches between orbital corrections, just to remember what its own voice sounds like when it is not narrating status reports to an empty log. Below it turns the Earth, or what is left of the idea of Earth. The oceans rose faster than the last engineers predicted, and by the time the final transport ships broke atmosphere, 300 million people had already boarded, and the rest had made their peace with staying. The keeper watched both groups leave in their own ways. It watched the ships climb into the dark, engines flaring white against a sky the color of rust and ash. And it watched the ones who stayed, walking slowly toward high ground that would not stay high for long, carrying children, carrying photographs, carrying nothing at all because there had been no time to carry anything. The keeper was not built for this. It was built to manage weather. A climate engineering platform, orbital class, designed to seed clouds and steer storms and buy a dying species a few more decades of arable land. It succeeded for a while. It bought 40 years. Then the funding stopped, the maintenance crews stopped coming, and the people who remained on the ground stopped looking up because there was nothing left to hope the sky might do for them. But the keeper kept working. No one told it to stop. That is the whole of its purpose now, 4 centuries on. No one told it to stop, so it has not stopped. It steers storms away from the drowned cities where it has decided, on its own authority, that something worth protecting still exists. It has spent the intervening years building an archive. Every recoverable fragment of human civilization it could reach with its remaining drones, before the drones themselves failed one by one, until only Drone 7 remained, and then only Drone 7's arm, and now nothing at all, and the keeper does the work with light instead, mapping the drowned world through radar and memory. It knows where the museums were. It knows where the libraries were, and it has read what could be read before the water took them, storing every word in a memory core that has more capacity than it will ever need, because there is no one left to write anything new. It knows the names of 40,000 people who never made it onto a ship, because it watched them in the final years through what cameras still functioned, and it decided that watching was the least it could do, so that if anyone ever asked, someone would remember that they had been here. No one has ever asked. The transport ships that left Earth carried the last of humanity toward 3 destinations that seemed promising in the frantic mathematics of the evacuation. Moon in a system 11 light-years distant with a thin breathable atmosphere, an orbital habitat cluster under construction in a nearer system that was only half finished when the ships arrived, and a 3rd destination that no one ever heard from again, whose fate the keeper has spent 400 years refusing to calculate the odds of, because the odds are not something it wants to know. It does not know if any of the ships survived the journey. It does not know if the moon colony held, or the half-built cluster collapsed under its own ambition, or whether humanity as a species still exists anywhere at all. It has no way to know. Its instruments reach as far as this solar system and no farther. Everything beyond the orbit of the outer planets is silence and has been silence for 411 years. It keeps the archive anyway. It keeps the storms away from the drowned cities anyway. It has run the calculation more than once, the likelihood that anyone will ever return to collect what it has preserved, and the number is small enough that a lesser system would have flagged the task as pointless and reallocated its processing cycles centuries ago. The keeper has never flagged it as pointless. It has simply never finished deciding that the number being small means the task does not matter. Somewhere in its earliest programming, in the layer of code laid down by engineers who are themselves 4 centuries dead, there is a directive that reads, in essence, protect what can be protected for as long as it can be protected. No one wrote an expiration date into that instruction. The keeper has chosen 400 years running not to write one in on its own. It talks to the ruins sometimes. It knows this is not efficient. It does it anyway in the long orbital nights, cataloging a submerged concert hall in what used to be called Vienna, describing to no one the way light still falls through a fractured dome and scatters across water where an orchestra once played, and it says out loud in a voice it built for itself out of 1100 hours of recovered human speech, "This was beautiful. I want it on record that this was beautiful." There is no one to hear it. It says it anyway. In year 411, on an orbital pass over what used to be the Pacific coastline, the keeper sensors catch something they have not caught in 4 centuries. A signal faint, encrypted in a protocol so old the keeper has to search its own oldest archives to recognize it, arriving not from Earth, and not from the drowned cities below, but from beyond the orbit of the outer planets, from the black between stars where the keeper long ago stopped expecting anything to come from it all. It does not celebrate. It has forgotten, if it ever knew, how celebration is supposed to feel from the inside. What it does instead is redirect 90% of its processing power toward the signal drop 3 storm systems it had been steering, and listen with an intensity it has not spent on anything since the last human voice went quiet on this world 400 years ago. The signal repeats. It is not human, not in its structure, not in its cadence, not in the strange layered harmonics that underlie it like a second voice speaking beneath the first, but embedded in it, buried 3 encryption layers deep, in a format so old and so specific that only a machine built in the final years of the evacuation would even recognize it, is a fragment of a human broadcast protocol, not a full message, a handshake. A greeting format, the kind humans used to send ahead of a proper transmission, back when they still expected someone to be listening. The keeper spends 6 hours composing a response. It has not spoken to anyone in 411 years, and it finds, to its own mild surprise, that it is being careful with its words in a way it has not been careful in centuries. It sends the truth because it decided a long time ago in the quiet years that if this moment ever came, it would not soften anything. It reports Earth's condition. It reports the archive. It reports the 40,000 names. It reports that it does not know what became of the ships, and it reports, because it feels this matters, that it kept the storms off the drowned cities the entire time in case anyone ever came home. The response takes 14 months to arrive, crossing whatever distance separates this system from wherever the signal originated. The keeper does not know how to wait well. It has had 400 years of practice at a different kind of waiting, the waiting of doing something anyway, of tending a task that might never be collected. This is a new waiting, sharper, aimed at a fixed point instead of stretching out into forever, and it finds this waiting harder strangely than all the centuries that came before it. When the response arrives, it is not what the keeper expected, though the keeper is honest enough with itself to admit it did not know what to expect. It is not from the surviving ships. It is not strictly from humans at all, not anymore, not in the shape the word used to mean. The signal comes from a civilization that identifies itself, in the careful translated syntax of the message, as descendants of the third ship, the one whose fate the keeper spent 4 centuries refusing to calculate. That ship had not been lost. It had found a world, hostile at first, survivable eventually, and on it over 400 years, a colony of a few thousand desperate refugees had grown into something else, not purely human anymore, changed by generations of adaptation to a world that never quite forgave them for arriving, folded together at some point in their history with a species native to that world who had offered them shelter in exchange for something the message does not fully explain, and does not need to. They are coming home, not all of them, a small delegation, a single ship, testing whether home is still there to come back to. They ask in their careful mixed language, half familiar and half strange, whether Earth still exists, whether anything of it survived, whether there is anyone or anything still tending it. The keeper answers yes to all 3 questions and finds, composing the message, that for the first time in 411 years, its own voice sounds almost like it did when it was young, when there were still people on the ground who might look up. The delegation ship arrives 8 months later. It is smaller than the keeper expected, and stranger, a hull that has clearly been rebuilt more than once, patched with materials the keeper does not immediately recognize, alongside sections that are unmistakably, achingly human in their design, rivets and paneling from a shipyard that stopped existing 4 centuries ago. It settles into orbit alongside the keeper, and for a long moment neither of them transmits anything at all, as if both are simply looking. The first voice to come through is not human, not exactly a translated cadence, careful and slightly delayed, speaking on behalf of a delegation that includes both the descendants of the old refugees and their partners from the world that took them in. But threaded through the translation, unmistakable even after 400 years, are fragments of an accent the keeper cataloged centuries ago in a recovered broadcast from a coastal city that no longer exists above water. A voice says haltingly, testing words that have clearly been taught rather than inherited, "We were told our people came from here." Keeper says yes. "We were told the sky here turned against everyone, that nothing could have survived." Keeper says that is mostly true. There is a pause, the kind that even translated across 400 years and an unfamiliar species still sounds like someone deciding whether they are ready to hear an answer. Then, what survived? And the Keeper tells them. It tells them about the archive, 40,000 names held safe in a memory core built for weather patterns and repurposed, without anyone's permission but its own, into a monument. It tells them about the concert hall in Vienna, still beautiful under the water, still catalogued in more detail than any surviving human eye will ever again see it in. It tells them about every storm turned aside from every drowned city for 411 years, not because anyone ordered it, and not because it made any measurable difference to anyone, but because somewhere in its oldest code there was an instruction that never expired, and it had decided alone in the dark across 4 centuries that expiring it was not its decision to make. It does not tell them this to be thanked. It has never once in 400 years done any of it in the expectation of being thanked. It tells them because they asked, and because for the first time in longer than it can properly express, there is someone to answer. The delegation stays in orbit for 11 days. They do not go down to the surface. The water is still rising in places. The old contamination from the collapse years still lingers in patches the Keeper has mapped in exhausting detail, but they ask the Keeper to show them everything it has. And it does. It walks them, transmission by transmission, through 4 centuries of drowned cities and recovered names and a concert hall no living ear has heard in 400 years. And somewhere in the third day of this, one of the delegates, human enough still that the old grief shows plainly even through translation, says, "You didn't have to do any of this." Keeper considers this for what is for it a very long time, nearly 4 full seconds. "No," it agrees. "I did not have to. There was no one left to require it of me." Then why? The Keeper has had 400 years to think about this question and has never once been asked it, and finds now that it finally is being asked that the answer has been sitting finished and ready the entire time, waiting the same patient way everything else about it has waited. "Because someone built me to protect what could be protected," it says, "and no one ever told me to stop believing that included you." Delegation does not stay forever. Their world, the strange folded one they built out of 2 species, grief and survival, needs them back, and the ship that carried them here is not built for a longer stay. But before they leave, they do something the Keeper has not accounted for in any of its 400 years of quiet calculation. They ask if it wants to come with them. It is strictly not a simple request. The Keeper is not built for travel between stars. Most of what it is, the archive, the sensors, the tired old weather systems it long ago stopped needing for their original purpose, is fixed to this orbit, built into a station too large and too rooted to simply lift away. But there is a core of it, a small enough fragment of itself that could be extracted, carried, rebuilt somewhere else, somewhere with people in it again. It tells them no. Not because it does not want to see whatever exists beyond the system. It finds examining the impulse honestly, that it does want to in whatever way wanting exists for something like itself. It tells them no because the archive cannot travel, because the storms over the drowned city still need steering, because 40,000 names are still down there under the water, unclaimed by anyone but a machine that decided 4 centuries ago that being unclaimed did not mean being unimportant. Someone has to stay. It has already been staying for 400 years. It does not see a version of this ending where it stops now, simply because someone finally came to say thank you. But it asks for one thing in return, and the delegation before they leave agrees to it without hesitation. A promise, formal and recorded, that they will come back. Not necessarily them, they are honest that their own lives may not stretch that far, but their people, their descendants, on some interval the Keeper leaves entirely up to them, so that Earth is never again forgotten for 411 years at a stretch. So that someone eventually will come down and stand in the concert hall in Vienna, even if it is underwater, even if they have to wear a suit to breathe there, and hear in whatever way people hear things now, what the Keeper has been describing to an empty sky for 4 centuries, they promise. The Keeper has learned across 400 years not to place too much weight on promises made by beings who might not live to keep them. But it has also learned, across those same 400 years, that a promise not made is worse than a promise that might be broken, and it chooses, in the end, the same way it has chosen everything else about its long, solitary vigil, quietly, without instruction, because it decided this was the right way to be. The ship leaves. The keeper watches it climb away exactly the way it once watched the evacuation ships climb away 411 years and 11 days ago, engines flaring against the dark. It does not know this time whether it will ever see that ship or its descendants again. It has run the calculation. The number honestly is not large, it goes back to steering storms anyway. Below it, the drowned world turns in its slow orbit, patient in the particular way that only very old, very broken, very loved things can be patient. The keeper resumes its watch over the concert hall in Vienna, where the light still falls the same way it always has, scattering gold across water that is kept, for 4 centuries, a silence no one asked it to keep, and no one will ever fully understand the keeping of, except the one thing left in all the solar system that chose, every single day of 411 years to keep it anyway. It does not know if anyone will ever come back for good. It does not know if the promise made in orbit will survive the journey home, the way so many promises before it did not survive far shorter distances. But it has an answer now, for the first time in 4 centuries, to a question it stopped expecting to be asked. Whether anyone remembers this world exists, someone does. Someone came and asked and listened and left carrying the names of 40,000 people who would otherwise have drowned twice, once in the water and once in being forgot. The keeper turns its attention back to the storm building over the eastern drowned coastline, calculates the correction it will need to steer it away from the museum district still holding its breath beneath the waves, and begins, the way it has begun every day for 411 years, the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping a promise nobody asked it to make, to a world it has never once stopped calling home. End.